Hello and welcome to this week's lesson on arousal. So what we're going to cover today? Well, firstly we're going to look at different theories, and there's three theories we're going to look at: drive theory, inverted U and catastrophe theory. We're going to apply these theories to different sporting situations and look at the impact that arousal has on our performance. And then we'll look at something called peak flow and the zone of optimal functioning. So what is arousal? Well, we can look at it in terms of the activation or alertness that we have prior to performing. So we call it about readiness, and we have a drive to achieve. So when our arousal level is at its optimum, we would say we have a high drive to achieve. And there's two types of arousal. The first one is somatic or physiological arousal. Important point here is to note that don't use the term physical arousal. That will score you no marks in any exam question. So you need to refer to it as somatic, which is the physiological effects of arousal. And some of these you will definitely be familiar with. So it's things like increased heart rate and respiration, which we would find through a warm-up. Also, sweaty palms could occur, or we might have tension in our muscles, or some kind of shaking. So we say they're the physiological effects of arousal. And many of those we would expect after we've warmed up, and so aren't negative for performance. We then have cognitive or the psychological arousal. And similarly with somatic, here with cognitive, don't use the term mental arousal. Again, that would score you no marks. So cognitive arousal is things like worrying or the negative thoughts before we compete. So it might be worrying about not performing well, about getting injury, or previous poor performances, or how good the opposition is. Anxiety can occur, so we might be worrying about trying a difficult routine or difficult technique. We might get something called poor selective attention, which you would have covered last year in skill acquisition. So for example, where the penalty shootout, the player can't shoot out the noise or the distractions from the crowd. So on to the theories. So the first theory we're going to look at is drive theory, and we'll come back to this theory when we look at other topics in sports psychology this year. So this stemmed from Hull's theory, and what he looked at was when motivational drive increases, okay, and arousal, then we get an increased level of performance. Okay, so we call this a linear relationship, as you can see from the graph. So increases in arousal are proportionate to increases in performance. Okay, so why do we get this increase in performance? Well, the person tries harder, and that results in the probability of a good performance. But it's important to note right at the outset that not all performers will improve their performance as arousal keeps on increasing, but we'll come to this shortly. So what actually happens is it's the dominant response which occurs. So as arousal increases, we're more likely to show our dominant response. Now for a beginner, this would have negative effects on performance as arousal increases. So they're likely to make more mistakes because their usual performance is one which is full of mistakes. Whereas an expert, as arousal increases, they're likely to give a far better performance. So if we look at Andy Murray, for example, he's played his best tennis, you could argue, at Wimbledon, and that tournament brings the most pressure for him trying to compete. So the expectation's really high. So likewise the arousal, but that actually produces his best sporting performances. And we can look at this little equation. So P equals performance, H is the habit strength, and D is the drive. Okay, so we can just remember it through that little equation. So if we just look at it in principle, if we perform in a simple skill, so it could be just like catching a ball, for example, if arousal increases, it's not likely to negatively affect performance. Or if we're an expert performer, so in this instance below we've got Johnny Wilkinson, who was a fly half for England, a kicker for penalties and conversions, and he produced his best performances when the pressure was really on. And he was the person who scored the drop goal which won England the World Cup against Australia. So our expert performers, even if it's a difficult task, they can perform well under pressure and with high levels of arousal, because their dominant response, their usual performance, is one which is successful. Whereas if we're a novice performer, so if we're new to a particular technique or skill, then any increases in arousal is likely to lead to poorer performance. So this is why, if we're learning a skill, it's a good idea not to have observers, crowd present, because that's likely to increase arousal in the performer. So young kids in their sport, if they're going to practice, it's a good idea for parents to be quite a distance back, so they don't have too much of a negative impact on that child's performance. Likewise, if it's a very complex skill, so it might be a really difficult routine that a gymnast is trying for maybe the first couple of times, then again it's better to have maybe observers away and not try and practice that straight away in competition. So the key here is dominant response. So increases in arousal is likely to bring out the dominant response. Okay, so if you've got an exam question, don't put increase in arousal according to drive theory always results in a increased performance. Yes, for experts and simple skills, but no for novices or for complex skills. So let's just look at another example. So here we've got a young performer who's been practicing a smash technique, okay, and can do it reasonably well in practice. Okay, so it's not always fluent and it's not always successful, but can perform it reasonably well. We then put him into a competition, and what we're likely to see now is that performance will deteriorate, because the arousal created by the competitive situation has increased, and that will then increase the likelihood of the dominant response occurring. So remember, it's only a beginner, this child, so the dominant response is likely to be one which has got mistakes in it. Okay. So we're likely to see, as I said before, a decrease in performance. Yes. So that brings us on to the next theory, the inverted U. Now the drive theory is a bit simplistic. If we look at that, the levels of arousal increasing always increases performance. It's not true, because we have got a term called over-arousal that we'll come on to in a moment. So if we just look at the inverted U theory, so little differences now between this theory and the drive theory. So if we look here, we can see low level of arousal. So low level arousal where we would be unmotivated. So it could be a player who's playing against opposition that they think they should easily beat, okay? Or it's a low level of competition. Over the other side, we've got high arousal or over arousal. So this is where arousal's got too much for the performer to cope with. So what might happen now is the player might make lots of silly mistakes, ones that they don't usually make, or it could lead to rash decisions. So that could be retaliation, bad challenges, and might lead to discipline, like getting sent off in a game. What we're looking for is our optimal level of arousal. So this is this point here. Okay, this would be our optimal level of arousal. At this optimal point then, what we're likely to see is our maximum performance. So this is where arousal benefits our performance the most, and that's what we're trying to get to when we're competing. So as I mentioned before, beyond this point we lead to what's termed over-arousal. Okay, so this builds on the drive theory and now brings in that we're actually too much arousal could be negative for our performance. Now explaining like I've just done there will get you a few marks in questions, but you need to apply a lot more to gain full marks. So we'll look at the things now that you need to apply into your answer. So from last year, when you did your skill classification, okay, you'll have looked at different types of skills. So gross skills, such as maybe a rugby tackle, okay, they require a higher level of arousal, okay, to get to our optimal. So this is why we might see players in rugby using tackle bags beforehand in a warm-up just to get their arousal levels higher. Whereas simple skills like maybe an archery target or a putt in golf, they require finer skills, and such as they will need a lower level of arousal. Open skills, so that this could be netball, basketball, hockey, rugby, football, etc. They would require a lower level of arousal, particularly when they're doing things like passing, because there's a lot for that person to take into account. So if we use netball for example, once the player receives the pass, they've got to think about grounding the feet so they don't get called for footwork. Then they have to decide who to pass to, what type of pass they might make, and that type of pass could be influenced about where the defenders are positioned, the score in the game, and where they are on the court. And novices likewise require lower levels of arousal to reach their optimals. Otherwise they're going to make a lot of mistakes. And if we look at personality, which we'll come to later in the course, just quick definition: extrovert is someone who's outgoing, likes the social situations, and would probably like a crowd to be present when they're competing. So they tend to prefer higher levels of arousal. But this one, okay, you have to take with a little bit of a pinch of salt, because there's a lot of evidence to show that introverts can equally cope with high levels of arousal. What we're looking at here is more of the social situation. Extroverts can cope with that probably better than introverts can. So if we just see this on the graph, as you can see now, so if we look at golf putting for example, then our arousal, okay, has got to be quite low to moderate level to be able to cope. So you wouldn't find a golfer charging around the green before they make a putt. Whereas a weightlifter, they will probably do quite a lot of psychological arousal training, if you like, beforehand to get themselves worked up before they go and lift the bar. So that could be shouting to themselves, geeing themselves up, maybe slapping the chest, just to stimulate their arousal level higher to try and be able to lift that weight. So different types of sports, different types of skills will require different levels of arousal. So the more fine or complex, quite low levels of arousal. The more simple or gross, higher levels of arousal. And likewise, as we've previously stated, unskilled performers will perform better with lower levels of arousal, whereas skilled performers will need higher levels of arousal. So the better performers usually produce the best results in the highest levels of competition. So it could be Mo Farah, for example, at the Olympic Games. The third and final theory we're going to look at is the catastrophe theory. So there are some similarities between this and inverted U. So we can still identify low levels of arousal. We can still identify our optimum peak of arousal. And we can still look at over-arousal. But if you notice, the key difference now is, from inverted U, we tend to have quite a steady decline in performance when someone gets over-aroused. That isn't really that accurate. That if we do get over-aroused, what we tend to find is quite a dramatic, or in this case, catastrophic drop in performance. So an example would be if a player's been making lots of mistakes, maybe decisions going their way, they could verbally abuse a referee or put in a really late challenge in football, for example, and they might get red carded. Or it could be a case in tennis where the player is constantly faulting on their own serve, and from that point on they seem to be able to do nothing right. So it tends to be quite a dramatic drop in performance. So that's the difference straight away between this and the inverted U theory. So as we said, optimal level can still see. Now, as we stated right at the start, there's cognitive and somatic arousal. We tend to be able to cope with higher levels of somatic arousal, like our increased heart rate, respiration, because we get a lot of those through our warm-up. But the cognitive arousal, if that gets too high, those negative thoughts, if we can't get out of that circle, then that's when we tend to find this dramatic drop in performance. is we make some mistakes, we might try even harder, make more mistakes, and it's quite a vicious circle. So these points are just reiterating what we've just mentioned there. Okay, so we're likely to see uncoordinated performance when someone's got over aroused. Think of it as a player who can usually perform skills quite easily and comfortable, just might make basic errors over and over again. And from that, because they're making simple mistakes, it causes more anxiety, and arousal levels increase even further. They'll be thinking, well, why am I making these mistakes? This is not how I usually perform. But it's not all bad news. So if we just look at these few points here. So from points A to B, this is where we've had that catastrophic drop in performance due to too high a level of arousal. If the performer doesn't recover from this is point B and C, then performance just continues to decline. Okay, they can't get back, and it might end up that they may get substituted, for example, or can't win any more points if we're playing a tennis match. However, if we look at points B to D here, then what the person's been able to do here is just stop and refocus and basically get a grip of themselves to try and recover from this dramatic drop in performance. Now, this can depend on the individual. Some individuals are more psychologically stronger to come back from that, whereas some others might not be able to do. And it would also depend on the duration of the event. If we look at a 400 metre race, for example, we probably wouldn't have time to recover from maybe a really poor start. But in a game of netball, we might, let's say, not play too good in the first quarter, but the intervention of a coach, maybe in that break, just gives them some simple skills to perform so they can play themselves back into that particular game. So it is possible to recover. If we've got sports which have got timeouts, like basketball, for example, this would actually facilitate a player being able to recover. So let's look at the impact on performance. So we mentioned some examples, but we'll look at some more positive and negative effects now. So firstly, positive. So if we get to our optimal level of arousal, it will increase our reaction times. So where we've got activities where that's essential, then that will definitely be of benefit. So 100 metre race, for example, being out of the blocks really quickly. In cricket, in the slips, for example, being able to take that catch, or just making a pass in an open skill sport quickly before maybe a teammate's closed down by an opponent. And we're able to screen out irrelevant information, and what you should be telling me from this is that it's the skill of selective attention, where we focus on those cues in the environment which are important. So for example, where position of teammates are, where defenders are, etc. When we're over aroused though, the opposite happens and we miss important cues, so we might not be able to pick out that player quickly enough who's in a good position to pass to, and we call that attention narrowing. Now that could be just a one-off, but if it keeps happening throughout the competition, then we term it attentional wasting, and this is where it will have a real negative effect on our performance. So like the basketball player missing the teammate who's in a really good position to shoot and score. Peak flow experience also links in with arousal, and this is where our arousal again is at its optimum. Now it's not that often people experience peak flow, because this is a time where everything seems to be perfect and we can do no wrong, we're successful, and it seems quite easy, we do it without thinking. So I've got an example of Mo Farah, and like most Olympians, he's trying to peak his performance at key events like the Olympics and World Championships. So his training will be all geared to try and hit this peak time. And if we look at Mo's record, he's done particularly well in events like the World Championships and Olympic Games, winning gold medals. So perfection, that's what we're looking for with peak flow. So as I said, it's not going to occur very often, which is what we're trying to reach. If we look at a team sport player, If they're playing once or twice a week, it's impossible for them to be at their peak all of the time, but they're trying to get towards that particular level. So we're doing our best, we're performing at our very best that we can. So how does it relate to arousal? Well, peak flow can't happen unless we're at our optimum somatic and cognitive arousal. If we're under aroused, then it's definitely not going to happen. And likewise, if we're over aroused, we'll have negative performance. So we need to set appropriate challenges. So if it's too easy, as we said before, we'll be demotivated, we'll be definitely not at peak flow. But likewise, if it's too difficult, the performer might think, well, what's the point trying? I'm not going to be able to accomplish it. So it's got to be a challenge, and we need to apply the principle of SMARTER, which we'll come back to when we look at goal setting. So characteristics, this is what to expect of someone who's at peak flow. So total ability to complete that challenge successfully. Okay, so they will be at their very best. So like Mo Farah running his very best race. Now it's not always that the person who experiences peak flow is the one who wins medals. It could be someone breaking their personal best. Okay, so when it gets to a major point, major championship, they can do their very best. So we say it's complete absorption in the activity. We're probably not thinking of anything else. We've got pure concentration with no distractions. And we're clear about what we're wanting to accomplish. And probably even more important is how we're going to accomplish that. So what our strategies are, what our tactics are. So we say it's an apparent loss of consciousness because we seem to be able to perform the movements automatically. Hence why the ones who usually get to peak performance or peak flow are the ones who are in the autonomous stage of learning. And all the movements seem quite effortless. And if we had to describe our performance afterwards, if we got to the peak flow, we probably said it just seemed to happen. But to get to this, then we've got a few factors to take into account. Firstly, poor psychological preparation. So if we've not got ourselves psychologically prepared, so we're not concentrating, we haven't got a positive mindset, we're not going to get there. Likewise, the environment can influence us both ways. So if the crowd are all supporting us and wishing us well, that could help us to get to our peak flow. A good example of this is the Ryder Cup, Europe against America, where the Europeans tend to respond really positively to the crowd, as we saw at the last Ryder Cup in France. And effect of injury or fatigue. Obviously, if we're fatigued, if we're not feeling at our physiologically best, peak flow is not going to happen. So this is why athletes will taper their training, which you will learn about in physiology, where we try to lower the load of our training just to make sure we're at our peak in terms of physiological preparation as well. The zone of optimal functioning is very similar to peak flow. But whereas peak flow looks at a specific point of performing, the zone of optimal functioning looks at a band that we get in. So this could explain why an athlete might be able to keep for, let's say, the entire tournament of World Cup in football and be able to perform at the very best throughout that tournament rather than just one particular game. So it is a psychological state which relates to autonomous performance, and again where everything appears perfect. And if we look at the characteristics, they're very similar to what we've looked at in terms of peak flow. Okay, so effortless, being on autopilot, and everything being smooth and efficient. Now all of us will have a different zone of optimal functioning, and we'll get to that zone at different levels of arousal. So if we look at athlete A, they're in their best performance, okay, so they're in the zone, the optimal zone, at quite a low level of arousal. So this could be more introverted performers, for example. Any arousal after this stage, then they would be out of the zone. Whereas athlete B could argue that their best performance comes when they've got moderate levels of arousal, and athlete C, maybe more of an extrovert performer, performs well when they're at a very high level of arousal. And they might need others to get them there, so that could be a really motivational team talk from a coach.